The biggest party of the summer has long been the tagline for WWE Summerslam, and for the most part, the annual event has lived up to that festive suggestion. As something of a junior WrestleMania, the best SummerSlams have featured high-profile title bouts, celebrity appearances, raucous crowds, and classic matches and moments. In some cases, SummerSlam has ended up being WWE's strongest pay-per-view of a given year, the 1992, 2002, and 2013 events as an example. That certainly couldn't be said for the subject of this video. I mean, if this was WWF's best pay-per-view for that year, then WWE probably wouldn't exist today, and would instead have their shortcomings ridiculed in documentaries on the WCW network. These were not banner times for the then World Wrestling Federation, and this event is a perfect encapsulation of the era's malaise. If this was indeed the biggest party of the summer, then for the next year, you'd make a point to seek out new hosts. The 1996 SummerSlam is one of the worst shows ever. I'll be honest right here at the onset. Picking a SummerSlam for worst shows ever wasn't all that easy. If I were to ask you what the worst Royal Rumble or a WrestleMania ever was, certain usual suspects would immediately come to mind. But SummerSlam? Well, that's a little trickier, because while there have been SummerSlams that were septic tank adjacent, none of them do the same brown-coated backstroke that certain Rumbles and Manias do. So, a small consolation. So in trying to decide which SummerSlam to do for this series, I texted Adam and asked him to pick between 4 different years: 1996, 2003, 2007, and 2010. Mind you, I didn't actually mention anything about SummerSlam, so his response was, well, I like 1996 because you weren't born yet. I think he's still mad about me heating up a metal soup can in the break room microwave. How was I supposed to know it was going to set a fire? I nearly failed biology, or chemistry, or whatever it is. Microwave is old anyway. We need a new one. Nonetheless, I happily accepted the 1996 SummerSlam assignment with great enthusiasm. After all, the new generation WWF is an often overlooked period. It was wedged between the Golden Age and the Attitude Era. And the reason why it's often overlooked is quite simple. The new generation sucked more than a sentient Henry Hoover with really bad OCD. Seriously, if Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels had both been eaten by a T-Rex in the first Jurassic Park film in 1993, what would have ended up being the new generation's greatest highlight? Fantasio pulling a jobber's pants out of his singlet? That actually might be the greatest highlight. Yeah. So much heavy lifting was done by Bret and Shawn in this period, and it was usually up to their efforts to save most pay-per-views. Case in point, the previous 2 SummerSlams. Each of them had one match that was in the neighbourhood of 5 stars, and without those matches, we're probably looking at 2 viable candidates for this very series. And while the undercards of those shows weren't complete disasters, the main events were the sort of bedwetting catastrophes that inspire Mystery Science Theatre levels of snark. So yeah, viva la Match of the Year candidates, for they save some otherwise subpar SummerSlams. Speaking of subpar, that brings us to 1996 WWF. This is the first time that SummerSlam is being produced by what is now considered the number 2 company, as WCW and the NWO have snared Vince McMahon's shaky empire in a rear naked choke. WCW is now the place to be, and Nitro is the show to watch, as weekly TV ratings are squarely in the favour of the Atlanta-based upstart. It certainly doesn't help matters that workhorse Bret has been AWOL for the last 4.5 months. The Hitman took a sabbatical after WrestleMania 12, during which his WWF contract lapsed, and Vince was going to have to dig deep to keep him from taking Eric Bischoff's mouth-watering offer. Not to worry though, Vince and Bret soon agreed to terms on a staggering new contract, and that was the end of any issues they ever had. Anyway, the WWF heads into SummerSlam with all the forward momentum of a burning mattress lying at the side of a road. Between an ice-cold product, a depleted main event picture, and the sort of mindless and hollow kid-friendly presentation that makes Teletubbies look like Pulp Fiction, it's clear Vince and the troops are facing an uphill battle. Fortunately, they have the gifted general in Michaels, their WWF champion. He's the veritable face of the new generation and the undisputed top guy for near 5 months now. After dispatching villains like Diesel and the British Bulldog, Bulldog. For SummerSlam, Michaels moves on to the challenge of Vader, the frightening and agile behemoth that's held world titles on 3 different continents. The valiant and resourceful Michaels versus an idealized final boss such as Vader feels like the perfect supercard main event. And speaking of big matches, one of the better feuds of this period pitted The Undertaker against Mankind. Since April, the 2 indestructible heavyweights have been battering each other, and this war might be coming to a head at SummerSlam, as Taker and Mankind are set to square off in the first ever Boiler Room Brawl. Really tough to say that. Alas, some novelty. A new room for Mick Foley to take an inadvisable bump in. Now you may be wondering, what of the 1996 King of the Ring? What of him? Yes, Stone Cold Steve Austin won the 1996 tournament, improvised a brilliant catchphrase in his coronation speech, and set about turning the wrestling world on its ear. As for what top-of-the-line match awaited Austin at SummerSlam, well, he gets to work the pre-show against Yokozuna, a man who hasn't been pushed in months and is slowly being phased out due to his weight issues. Apparently when Austin became king, he became a chess king in the sense that WWF's only letting him move one space at a time. But surely the rest of the SummerSlam main card will make up for Austin's strange omission. There's also a match between Sycho Sid and the British Bulldog, which makes sense for what is an extension of the Michaels versus Camp Cornette feud, as one of Shawn Michaels' allies takes on one of Vader's allies. Not much story beyond that, except that perhaps Bulldog could be seeking revenge for the time Sid hired a man in a shark costume to blow up his boat in WCW. Note to self, do a video on Beach Blast 93 one day. Speaking of WCW alums that didn't leave on the greatest of terms, there's a singles match between Wildman Mark Merrow and Goldust. Not much story there either. In further singles actions though, you have Owen Hart taking on Savio Vega, which also has not a lot of story there, to be honest. SummerSlam's really starting to look like a house show with, well, lights. You'd have better luck looking for stories in the owner's manual of like a wood lathe. Well, one match does have a story, and it's a pretty amusing one. It's Jake the Snake Roberts taking on Jerry Lawler, spurred by Lawler making fun of recovering alcoholic Jake for his years of personal issues. That's not that amusing, actually. It's quite messed up. Well, thankfully, this is a company where the babyface usually triumphs, so while Lawler's acting needlessly cruel by mocking Jake's drinking problems, we can all rest assured that Jake will vanquish the evil King in the end. Oh, there's a tag team title 4-way match featuring 2 cowboys, 2 fitness gurus, 2 pig farmers, and a bastardized sequel to The Rockers. I know it sounds like I'm glossing it over, but I'm actually putting the same level of care into the match that WWF apparently did in 1996. Seriously, the WWF's tag team division back then was more hollow than a parking cone, but certainly not shiny. 4 mid-card gimmick teams, meanwhile the outsiders are on the other channel. Just saying. And that's SummerSlam 1996, everybody. If ever a WWF pay-per-view stood a chance of being beaten by a Connie Chung Christmas, this was the one. Credit where it's due though. The 9th annual SummerSlam did draw a crowd of 17,000 at Cleveland Guns Arena to the tune of a very healthy $400,000 gate. In trying times, that was certainly good news for the WWF. But then the show started. We began with what was then known as the Freeforall. It's like a kickoff show, minus the panel of 4 talking heads, taking turns reciting artificial buzzwords, while cans of sponsored beverages sit beside them, you know, with the logos facing out. And who needs a kickoff panel when you've got Austin versus Yokozuna in a sub 2 minute match, mostly dominated by Yoko, and ends when the rope breaks under his massive weight as he attempts the banzai drop. And when I say the ropes break, I mean Yoko has to pull on the gimmick turnbuckle like he's dragging a stubborn donkey in order for it to actually break. So red hot, reigning king, Austin only wins because Yoko's out of shape and Yoko looks like a dope for losing in such an embarrassing manner. Really roaring out of the gates, aren't we? Speaking of crap, the Free-for-all also played host to a hilarious segment involving an in-house beach party. The ever so alternative Bikini Beach Blastoff featured mid-carders galore, frolicking in or around a swimming pool. Now I know this all sounds like an excuse for the WWF to trot out their first wave of divas in swimwear, and it was, but rest assured the good tidings of cheesecake were mitigated by the fact that Jerry Lawler apparently took a dump in the pool. No, really. Here's some visual evidence that corroborates that prior sentence. And the punchline obviously was resident WWF plumber TL Hopper jumping into the pool, retrieving the cylindrical brown object, and then taking a bite out of it. Some of you with good taste in movies get that this was an homage to the 1980 comedy Caddyshack, in which a suspicious-looking Baby Ruth bar ends up in the country club pool, and it's Bill Murray that happily chows down on it. Poor TL Hopper though. If you really wanted to eat poo, he should have just spent the money to watch this pay-per-view. The main broadcast begins with Owen Hart and Savio Vega, which has the potential to be pretty decent. Owen is, well, Owen, and Savio, participation in the horrendous 1995 King of the Ring aside, go check out that worst shows ever, has always been rock solid. You can probably count on those two for a fast-paced, exciting opener. Unless one of them's doing an injury angle, and they spend 13-minute match trying to get said injury over. Owen's doing the old Cowboy Bob Orton cast gimmick, where he claims a perpetually injured arm, but is actually using his forearm cast as an illegal weapon. So first, we get a Caddyshack reference. Then they dig up some heel shtick from 1985, kind of hoping for a timely Ferris Bueller homage, and then somebody getting salt thrown in their eyes. I guess this next match anyway. Owen versus Savio is pretty much at house show speed, as they use a lot of wear down holds. There's also an angle involving Jim Cornette attorney Clarence Mason, who tries to usurp Owen as a client while Cornette is preoccupied with getting Vader ready for the main event. All of this leads to Owen braining Savio with a cast and then putting the sharpshooter on his already unconscious opponent. So yeah, not bad, but certainly nothing memorable. Firmly in the category of just a match. Up next is the 4-way tag title bout between the Smoking Guns, the New Rockers, the Godwinns and the Body Donnas. The most over person in the match was Sonny, while the 4 teams actually in the match itself have the collective heat of a snowman's taint. I think the Cleveland crowd began their collective 3-year no football until 1999 coma at the onset of this match. Or maybe they just decided to join Savio in a sympathy nap. Chris Candido may as well have joined in with the collective slumber, seeing as he was wearing a neck brace after quite literally breaking his neck at Madison Square Garden about a week before this show. He understandably did nothing, and the Body Donnas were eliminated first. After 12 minutes of objectively bad wrestling and total disinterest from the crowd, Daddy Ass and Uncle Punch retained their belts, thus earning the right to drop them to a more interesting team at the following months in your house. That wasn't the actual stipulation, but it should have been. Next we get Davey Boy Smith versus Sycho Sid, and boy is the big man over. No matter the era or the company or even the alignment, fans have always popped big for Sid. So Cleveland was certainly overjoyed to see Sid dispatch the Bulldog with a chokeslam and a powerbomb after 6.5 minutes, all while Cornette and Mason bickered at ringside. I should note that, pre-show included, this is the first babyface win of the night, and I'm starting to get serious WrestleMania 32 vibes here. You know, the heels win most of the matches, thus depriving the crowd of a cathartic release, forcing them to cheer in the main event for a somewhat polarizing babyface star that's way too heavily endorsed by Vince. Speaking of WrestleMania 32, we've also done a worse shows on that. Go and watch that one. I don't know, maybe I'm just thinking about it too much. Let's take a quick glance at Uncle Dave's personal rating so far. And it's not exactly looking like a Big 4 pay-per-view now, is it? Fortunately, we're only halfway there and some heavy hitters remain, so let's just keep our chins up and hope for the best. We might even get more Caddyshack jokes. Perhaps someone will get struck by lightning. Next is Goldust and Mero, and wouldn't you know, another match where the real story is at ringside. Mankind randomly appears to chase Sable around a bit while calling her mummy, which is an angle that never went anywhere and was dropped quicker than a basketball made of liquid magma. There was actually also an in-match story, as commentators Jim Ross noted that Mero was promising to unleash a new move during the match, which is good because after 6 months of trying to break out as a push-worthy star, Mero really needs a statement win. And an emphatic punctuation to that win would do him wonders. After 10 minutes of what accounted to little more than a decent TV match, Mero ascended the ropes and propelled off with a high-arching shooting star press that he called the Wild Thing. This was a big deal for 1996 WWF because the shooting star press was a cutting-edge maneuver at the time. I mean, between the dating movie references and the hog farmer gimmicks, I can only assume a garden variety of abdominal stretch would have blown Vince's mind scanner style. Anyway, Mero hits a beautiful shooting star. Crowd loved it, commentary team marked out for it. Shame it didn't get the win though. Nope. Instead, it's Goldust who wins the match, winning with a patented curtain call. Yep. Babyface promises to unleash a new killer move, hits it, and then loses anyway. Classic babyface booking at its finest. Though, as Hunter later explained, the story never ends. So that's a relief. Adrenaline in my soul. Painful loss for Mark Moreau. That song. One story that I wish had ended before it left the gate was Lawler and Jake's dust up over Jake's alcoholism. Before the match, we get an appearance from recent Olympian Mark Henry, who's just signed a staggering 10-year deal with WWF, and that wouldn't require the kick-ass 3-6 Mafia theme until the tail end of that contract. Fortunately, his story never ended. Well, I think there's been enough talk. It's time for Mark Henry to talk on commentary during Lawler vs. Roberts. But first, here's the King to get some cheap heat. First by making fun of Cleveland fans for losing their Browns to Baltimore, and then making some cruel alcoholic jokes about Jake. Well, they mustn't have been that cruel, because babyface Mark Henry's laughing at them on commentary. And now you see why Vince insists on telling modern announcers how they're supposed to react to everything. So, Lawler taunts Roberts with some booze bottles, and then we get the actual match. And it's just crap. Jake sadly passed his prime, and all of Jerry Lawler's over-the-top selling and mugging isn't going to disguise the overall limitations. May as well just skip to the finish where Jake shuts Lawler up in order to get his revenge. Nope. Lawler wins after hitting Jake in the throat with a bottle. But wait, there's more. After the match, Lawler further debases Jake by taking a whiskey bottle and pouring the contents into Jake's face. Now originally the bottle was supposed to be filled with iced tea, but as a quote-unquote rib, they actually put whiskey in the bottle and had Lawler pour that onto Jake. The very same Jake that is a recovering alcoholic. Fear not though, because Jake did get his revenge on Lawler in October, on an episode of Raw that had been taped 3 weeks earlier, and was the least watched Raw since the start of the Monday Night Wars. Look, the story does end. It's just only 9 people were around to see it end. To the semi-main event we go as the Undertaker and Mankind square off in the first ever Boiler Room Brawl. Little fun fact, the first part of the match, what was taped inside the Boiler Room, was actually filmed the previous night. So we're actually watching like a 21-hour match. When it all added up. A 21-hour match that Mankind took a break during in order to confuse Sable for his mother. Does anyone else have a hard time explaining wrestling things to their non-wrestling fan friends? Anyway, the Boiler Room Brawl is a very unique spectacle. A weapon-slinging hardcore match in a dimly lit locale that is without commentary or audible crowd noise for about 10 minutes. The static camera shots give the brawl something of a found footage feel, and while it's not something you'd want to see all the time, it is certainly distinct and memorable. Of course, though, the Human Centipede trilogy is also distinct and memorable, but for the Boiler Room Brawl, I assure you I do mean it in the positive sense. God, I really hope nobody shows TL Hopper those movies. Ugh. Anyway, during the course of this brawl, Mick Foley takes one of the most costly bumps of his career as he's sent flying off a ladder and partially misses his intended cardboard crash pad, jacking up his sciatic nerve on the landing. Really, really nasty stuff. For a while, the match is fairly engrossing. So engrossing that I almost forgot what the rule of winning was. Turns out the first wrestler to make it to the ring and retrieve Paul Bearer's urn from Paul Bearer himself would be victorious. Kinda random, but we'll go with it. So after a long arena-spanning fight, the two brutes finally make it down the aisleway, where they're treated to an unintentionally hilarious sight. People of a certain age will remember in school when the teacher would bring in the TV on a wheeled cart, which was the universal sign of that's enough learning for today, time to watch a movie, or the teacher wanted a smoke break. The WWF did that for SummerSlam. The Titantron hadn't debuted yet, so some genius thought it was a brilliant idea to wheel 4 moderately sized TVs to ringside so that the ringsiders could watch the backstage portions of the match. Nothing like dropping $80 on floor level seats to watch most of the semi-main event on a Panasonic TV that's about this size. Anyway, this is the match where Bearer famously turns on the Undertaker, smashing him with the urn and handing it off to Mankind to give his new client the win. I guess Bearer offered to fill Mankind's mummy void until Sable came to her senses or something. Whatever, I'm not a psychiatrist. Almost failed chemistry. Remember, I mentioned that at the start of the video? Should be noted, 7 matches, 6 heel victories, unless you consider TL Hopper thwarting Hunger to be a babyface victory. But even then, Evil still holds a commanding lead, and I don't mean the New Japan Star. As for the match itself, it was admittedly polarizing. Some of the brawling was spectacular and brutal, but without a template for which to fashion a more focused match, it did drag at points. Meltzer didn't even rate it, in part because half of it was taped in advance though. Speaking of Dave, let's glance at his scorecard so far. And it does feel a little bit like a belated sequel to the 1995 King of the Ring, except this time Savio Vega might actually take home Match of the Night honours. But not quite. Admittedly, the world title match between Michaels and Vader was pretty awesome, with Dave giving it 4 stars. In the end, HBK slayed the beast to become another major feather in the cap of his first ever world title reign. It was a great match, but with one big turd in the punch bowl caveat. The WWF title bout is rather infamous for a miscue where Vader forgot to roll away from a Michaels top rope attack, resulting in Shawn landing on his feet, then screaming and cursing at Vader while throwing several awkward stomps. Michaels chalked up his unprofessionalism to cracking under the ongoing pressures of being champion of a struggling promotion, and spoke with regret about his actions years later. But at the time, it was an unnecessary blow-up in which the designated hero looked a little bit like an asshole. Michaels won and the overall match was pretty great, but through the decades, the most talked about moment remains Shawn's brief meltdown. Right or wrong, that's just the way it is. So to recap, you have an undercard that ranges from mediocre to lousy, a semi-main that is highly experimental and provokes mixed responses, just one babyface victory to that point, and a heroic triumph in a great main event that's partially diluted by said hero losing his cool. And no wonder Shawn was on edge. Metrics sank during his reign as champion. In fact, this is the least bought SummerSlam ever, pre-network, and the second least bought Big 4 pay-per-view of that same era. With the NWO hot on the other channel, not as many fans were interested in the exploits of Shawn and friends. But the question is 1996 the worst SummerSlam ever? Well, if you wanted great wrestling, you got a quality main event, but not much else. If you wanted a night of feel-good moments, babyfaces won only 2 of 8 matches. If you wanted shockwaves, you've got Paul Bearer double-crossing The Undertaker after 6 years, but that's about it. SummerSlam 96's biggest sin wasn't that it was a complete debacle of an event, but rather that it was just so uninteresting, filled mostly with matches that promised very little and delivered exactly that. Through a modern lens, today's fans would scoff at the idea that this was what WWF considered worthy of a Big 4 pay-per-view outing, and fans then? Well, they pretty much agreed actually. Hell, you saw the number of buys the show got. The 1996 SummerSlam was a microcosm of where the WWF stood at the time. Thin on big name talent, low on intrigue, and woefully behind the times. And with ratings and buy rates plummeting, the WWF was finding it harder to dine like kings. TL Hopper excluded, of course.